If you're an Edexcel A-Level Business student looking for a video to revise all of Theme 4.1 Globalisation, well, this video is for you. Because we're going to go through everything that you need to know for your exams, including looking at the UK economy and how it's growing, especially in comparison to our emerging markets. We'll also take a look at some of the key indicators of growth. Then we'll take a look at international trade and the factors that have contributed to globalisation. And then we'll finish off the session looking at protectionism and our trading blocks. Let's get into it. Now, the first topic that we'll take a look at in this revision video will be growing economies. Now, essentially what we want to do is we want to look at the economic growth rate of the UK in comparison with growing economic powers. Now, what we mean first of all by a developed economy is an economy that is highly industrialized with a high GDP. Now, if you're wondering what we mean by industrialized, all this means is having a well-developed manufacturing and production sector where industries and factories play a major role in the economy. And in terms of our GDP, yes, it's high, but the growth rate is a lot steadier and a lot smaller compared to emerging economies. But what you'll find is that we have a really advanced infrastructure and also a higher standard of living. Versus when we look at an emerging economy, this is a developing country experiencing rapid levels of GDP growth. But even though they have rapid GDP growth, their overall GDP per capita, so per individual, may still be relatively low. So we have a low overall wealth and income levels compared to these developed nations. You'll also find that within an emerging economy, infrastructure is not really that developed. In cities, yes, they may be a bit more developed, but not for all areas of the country. They do have a lot more risk as well when we invest into them, because even though, yes, we have a rapid GDP growth rate, it also could mean that the GDP growth may begin to decline quite rapidly. But they do attract a lot of foreign direct investment because, as we said, they do have the potential for higher returns. And the reason why you'll see an emerging economy have this high rapid GDP growth is because they have larger populations. Now, when we look at our growing economic powers, we have the BRICS, and this is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, these are rough estimates, but if you look across the last 20 years, the UK economy has grown around 65%. Now, you don't need to know these exact figures for your exam, it's just me demonstrating the growth rate of these emerging economies. Because if we look, the UK growth rate 65%, and roughly Brazil 289%, Russia 379%, India 487%, China, which is by far the quickest growing, 972% growth rate within their economy around the last 20 years. And South Africa, not as big as the others, but still 93%. But we also have Mint, and these are the new emerging economies. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. Now, these are just rough estimates, but Mexico, the growth rate on the last 20 years, 134%. Indonesia, 483%. Nigeria, 247%. And Turkey, 255%. So as you can see, these emerging economies, their growth rate within their economy is a lot more than the UK. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of those emerging economies, but the one I do want to take a look at is the comparison between the UK and China. Now, if we look at the UK GDP growth, it's been constant. Around each year, we've been growing around 2 to 3%. Now, there's only been very few times across the last 20 years where we had negative GDP growth. That was in, first of all, 2008 to 2009 financial crisis and, of course, COVID-19. But when comparing us to China, on average, we've got around 2 to 3% growth rate. Where you look on China, they're averaging anywhere between 8 to 15%. And when we look at the size of the economies as well, China, well, they were the same level of us in 2005. But because, of course, they've got larger population and their GDP growth is so much more than ours, we can see that over the last 20 years, they have completely trumped us in terms of their growth rate of their economy and the size of their economy. But as I've said, the wealth distribution in China compared to the UK is very different, because we've also got this concept called GDP per capita, which we are going to take a look at in a bit more detail in the indicators of growth within this session. But essentially, we're taking the country's GDP and dividing it by that population. And it basically looks at the living conditions of the people within that economy. Now, as you can see, the UK is still a lot higher than China. However, given the next 20 years based on their growth rate, it wouldn't surprise me if China does begin to surpass the UK. But now, what are the implications of economic growth? Well, the more the economy is growing, well, that's going to be dictated by the level of spending. So in economic growth, the level of spending goes up. And if more people are spending money, more businesses are making money because they've got higher levels of demand. So businesses are able to expand. However, that doesn't mean it's just good for me. It also is good for my competitors. So you may find that the level of intensity of competition also begins to increase. And of course, if businesses are growing, they're going to need to hire more employees. So another implication of economic growth is that this begins to generate more jobs. And as well, if you see a growth within the economy, the GDP per capita may also begin to increase. And as well, if the economy is growing, that might mean that the government is making more revenue from taxes. So they've got more money to reinvest back into the economy and into the country. So what you might find is that the overall education levels would also increase, so you get more skilled workers. The next topic that we're going to be taking a look at in this revision video will be our key indicators of growth within an economy. Now we've got several different ones. We've got GDP per capita, we've got the literacy levels, health levels, and also the HDI. Now, you do not need to know how to calculate GDP per capita or HDI for your exams, so keep that in mind. But all GDP per capita measures is the average economic output per person. It's key, GDP per capita doesn't necessarily say the average level of wealth per person, because it doesn't really account for income inequality and the cost of living in that country. Now, the way that we calculate it, even though you're not expected, I just want to show you how it's done. We take that country's GDP and divide that by the country's population. Now, a higher GDP capita typically indicates a more affluent population. And that might be quite useful for our luxury businesses to know, because I'm going to give a shout out to a theme 1 topic of income elasticity of demand, because it may suggest that on average income levels are rising. So we know that luxury goods are income elastic and a positive value. So typically an increase in income will lead to a greater increase in demand for our luxury businesses. But of course, they also want to measure, well, what is the average income within that country? Because there's no point moving to a country where customers can't necessarily afford these luxury goods. And I'm also going to bring back this example of the GDP per capita, UK versus China. Now, the UK's GDP per capita is significantly higher at the moment. But of course, in 2009, we did see a big dip within the GDP per capita for people in the UK. Now, when we look at China's GDP per capita, it does start a lot lower, but it is showing consistent growth, reflecting its rapid economic development. Now, whilst the UK, yes, still remains ahead, China's steady rise may suggest increasing consumer purchasing power and their economic expansion, which may start making it an attractive market for a lot of businesses to expand into. The next key indicator of growth that we also have is around the literacy levels. Now, this measures the percentage of the adult population, typically above the age of 15, that can read and write at a basic level. Now, in most developing countries, it is 100%. But there are countries around the world, especially these developing countries, where they don't have educational systems in place, where the literacy rates are actually around 50%. Now, the literacy rate of a country is important for businesses because it basically shows the quality of employees within that specific country. Because it's going to influence factors such as their communication skills, their productivity levels. It will also impact the level of professionalism of those employees and their ability to work in teams. Another key indicator of growth that we will also have will be around the health levels of that country. Now, as you can imagine, it's the overall well-being of a population. Now, this can once again impact different factors such as how long are people living for. Now, when we look at life expectancy, this can obviously impact economic growth, the age of your workforce, the demand for certain products or services. And essentially, the healthier that you are, in theory, your productivity levels should grow. Now, there are key health indicators that we want to take a look at. First of all, as I've said, life expectancy. So on average, how old are people living in that country? We've also got another one which isn't as nice to look into, but it is around infant mortality. So the amount of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. Now, this is going to be heavily influenced by the healthcare system in place in that country. We've also got as well the healthcare availability. So this is going to be influenced by the amount of tax that the government is making, because that would influence how much they have to invest into the healthcare system that they have within that country. We've also got an indicator around the access to clean water and sanitation, which of course then influences your life expectancy rate. The prevalence of diseases as well, so the rate of infectious diseases in that country and what do they have in place in terms of the healthcare availability to obviously overcome this. And we've also got the level of obesity versus malnutrition. So this one is more looking at the dietary health of that country. And finally, the last key indicator of growth, we have a concept called HDI, also known as the Human Development Index. And this is a measure of a country's social and economic development. First of all, based on life expectancy, which just measures the average number of years, as we said, that a person is expecting to live, indicating the quality of the healthcare, living conditions, and overall well-being in the country. Second is the education. Now, this is assessed through factors like literacy rates, which is what we've already looked at, and years of schooling, as once again, it will impact the workforce skills, employment opportunities, and economic growth in general. And finally, the income per capita. Now, this represents the average income per person in a country, which heavily influences the living conditions, access to essential services, and overall economic stability. Now, once again, you do not need to know how to calculate the HDI, but of course, the better the HDI, the more attractive it is for a business to invest into there. So a country with strong HDI rates typically will attract more foreign direct investments, which all that means is either an individual or a business from another country investing into that country, maybe making a production facility, maybe taking over a business that operates within that country. The next topic that we'll take a look at in this revision video will be around international trade and business growth. Now, something that we need to do first is identify what we mean by import and what we mean by export. Now, all an import is when, let's say myself within the UK, I have brought a product or service from overseas. Now, this can be on an individual basis or on a business basis. So we brought those goods and services into the country, either for consumption for the final consumer or for resale, such as the raw materials used to make products and services. So how this begins to look, and I do not want to admit how long this animation took me to make, the products and services are coming from overseas and brought into the UK. But something that we need to know is, where is the money flowing? Now, when we import, the money is actually flowing out of the country. So when we look at protectionism a little bit later on, we want to start restricting the amount of imports because we want to keep money in the UK and money flowing to the UK. Next one we have is exports. So if imports is goods flowing into the country, exports is when products and services are being sold out of the country. So they're produced within the UK and they are sold to foreign markets or customers in other nations. Back to the really cool animation. We make the products in the UK and then we sell them to overseas markets. But this time when we look at where the money is flowing, the money is flowing into the UK. And this is adding positively to our GDP. We like exporting in the UK because money's flowing into the UK. Now, just because you export does not mean you're a multinational corporation. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on in theme 4. But it's a great way for a business to start expanding, especially through a market development strategy from Ansoff's Matrix. Because we're taking the product and we're entering in brand new markets. We're entering overseas, these foreign markets. The next factor that we'll want to take a look at is this concept called specialization and how it could potentially lead to a competitive advantage. Now, specialization is when a country, business, or individual focuses on producing a specific good or service to improve efficiency. So specialization, it improves efficiency by allowing the workers or businesses or in the countries to focus on these specific tasks, leading to greater expertise, faster production, and reduced levels of waste. Now, this would overall increase the level of output whilst reducing the unit cost because our production is more efficient, henceforth a little bit of economies of scale. So rather than us producing loads of different products and learning all of these different processes, let's just focus on being good at one thing. And the reason why it leads to a competitive advantage, and remember, anytime you use that term in your exams, please try and relate this to Porter's generic strategies. But remember what Porter argued, there's one or two different ways that a business can gain and sustain a competitive advantage. either through low cost or through differentiation. Now with specialization, we either get really good at what we're doing, so maybe an element of differentiation because the quality starts to improve, but typically it will be around increasing the levels of efficiency. Because if you improve efficiency, you're able to run at a low cost strategy because the cost per unit begins to reduce. Now that can do one of two things, either give you higher profit margins or give you the ability to charge more competitive prices. The next thing that we need to do in this revision video is to explain what we mean by foreign direct investment. Now you may have heard me use this term earlier on in this video, but let's really understand what this actually means. Now, foreign direct investment, also known as FDI for short, is when a business or individual from one country invests in a company or assets in another. It will also help a business enter markets, typically bypassing our trade barriers. More on that when we look at protectionism. Now, countries will be more open to FDI because they are creating jobs for the local community. So an example of this is setting up a production factory overseas. So rather than me in the UK just exporting to that country, and of course we know when we export the money flows into my country, but when actually we set up that production facility in that country to sell to the local consumers, we're actually generating more economic activity. Because within that production facilities, we need obviously people working jobs there, and that could offer jobs to the local community. So rather than us just taking money from their economy into ours, we're helping stimulate their economic growth. Now the reason why my business might look at FDI is that it actually helps my company grow. Because first of all, it could give me access to new markets. And this can be quite important because the market that I'm currently in might be overly saturated. We may have hit a ceiling in terms of the growth of the business as well within that market. It could also give me access to unique resources, whether that's individuals with their skills or whether that's certain raw materials. Now, if we have specialized resources, as we said, that can help us gain a competitive advantage. And of course as well, increased levels of investment opportunities and more revenue that we can make. And what also is good about foreign direct investment, and something that we'll learn a little bit later on in this session, is that we've got these trade barriers, which essentially tries to restrict the amount of trade happening between each country. And we do this by either increasing the prices by adding a tax on there or limiting the amount. Now, if we are operating within that country, we now are bypassing those trade barriers. And not only that, but it could also be cheaper for my business to set up in the country and then start selling to the customers because the transportation costs for delivering those products may also reduce. Now, just a couple examples of what foreign direct investment looks like. First of all, we could look at buying a significant amount of foreign company shares. So this is FDI if the investment gives the buyer significant control, usually 10% or more shares of that business, allowing them to influence business decisions and operate in that foreign market. We could also look at forming joint ventures internationally. So this FDI involves two or more companies from different countries investing resources into a shared business operation. We could also look at either merging or acquiring a foreign firm, because once again, it results in the transfer of ownership and control of the company to this foreign investor. We could just simply look at expanding overseas as well. So by making a long-term investment in another country by establishing a physical presence, contributing to the local employment in that country. And of course, just opening factories overseas, once again, creating jobs for that local community. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video will be the different factors that are contributing to increased globalization. Now, what do we actually mean by globalization? Essentially, it's the network between different countries across the world. Because what we've seen with globalization is that we are more connected to different countries than we ever have been. That means our economies are connected, our cultures are connected. So rather than just seeing the UK as my market, I now see the entire globe as one big market. However, globalization isn't complete because there are still trade barriers that do exist. And because of the increased level of globalization, it means that overall revenue and trade between countries has started to increase. And we find that businesses start to operate in more countries. So we see that employees now have the ability to work anywhere across the world. But of course, now if the globe is one big market, well, that means the level of competition has also dramatically increased. Now, there are several different factors that have contributed to the increased level of globalization. And what we're going to do is we're going to break each of these down and explain how they've done this. First of all, trade liberalization. Very fancy way of saying the removal or reduction of trade barriers between different countries. And once again, we'll look at this in a bit more detail later on in this revision video, because we're going to have a look at what protectionism is. But typically it's removing or reducing the amount of tariffs and quotas between different countries. It also allows as well for more freedom for people to move across borders. Now, how does the reduction of trade barriers lead to the growth of globalization? Well, it just encourages more international trade, because if there's no barriers to trade, then it makes it easier for businesses to start sending their products or exporting their products overseas. So the countries now become more connected with one another. Next up we have is political change. Now, this is any shift within government, policies, leadership, or political systems within a country. So typically the election process where a new government party comes into power, this typically has a lot of impact on globalization. So in America, we've seen that Donald Trump has come back into power. Now, because of that, he's already implementing lots of trade barriers between different countries. So how does political change influence the growth of globalization? It can either speed it up or it could slow it down. It depends on who comes into power, because they will either want to promote more free trade, so remove more trade barriers, or they may want to put more trade barriers up, start putting tariffs on each country. But if we are promoting more free trade, it becomes a bit more attractive for foreign investors to invest into that country, because there's less political instability. The next major reason is going to be around the reduced cost of transportation. Essentially, it does what it says on the tin. For me to export a product from the UK and sell it overseas, it's become a lot cheaper for me to transport it. You know, before, if I had to try and transport a product that I produce into the UK over to China, it's going to cost a lot of money. But now we've seen more trading networks, and we've also got this factor called containerization. And this is the use of standardized shipping containers, henceforth the name containerization. And essentially, it's made it so much more efficient and reduced the cost to transport goods. I think I saw some statistic where around 20 years ago, it used to cost over £5 per tonne to use to ship products. Now it costs less than 20p per tonne. And the reason why containerization have done this is because of the efficiency. It's really easy to load these containers onto cargoes. And it's basically that concept of economies of scale, because we are shipping more units than ever before. The average cost to ship an individual unit has begun to reduce. So how does reduced cost of transportation then lead to the growth of globalization? Well, simply because it's easier to ship. It's going to cost the business less money. So if our costs are going down, then it makes it more of a profitable enterprise for a company to start exporting overseas or start importing raw materials. So now to enter these international market, the barriers to entry have dramatically reduced. And we know if that's the case, the threat of new entrants starts to increase. So now we're seeing more competition in these international markets. And not only that, but it's easier for people now to work across the world, because the cost of flying now, due to the growth of these low-cost budget airline businesses, has made it even cheaper for us to do this. And of course, there's more flights than we've ever seen before, so it's just going to be so much easier for people to travel. And another major factor on why globalization has increased is due to the improvements of communication technology, because now we're able to communicate with anyone across the world instantaneously. So this starts to support international trade, because before, if I wanted to have a message sent to someone in China, then I may have to have done it by post. But now I can send an email and they are going to receive it within the next few seconds. So communication across the different countries has dramatically increased and become more efficient, which has allowed businesses now to expand. And as well, if I'm an online service business, well, it's easy for me now to sell my services to people across the world, because they're able to do this through obviously the electronic communication systems. So how does improved communication then lead to the growth of globalization? Well, improved communication first of all enables more remote work, because even though I've got a UK business, I'm now able to offshore or outsource a lot of the operations of the company to other countries. And as we've already said, with international expansion, and of course it strengthens your global partnerships because you're able to communicate with them a lot more efficiently. Another major factor is the increased level of these global companies. Now, we're going to be taking a look in a lot more detail in Theme 4 at our multinational corporations, also known as our MNCs. To give a quick definition, all a multinational corporation is that a business that operates in multiple countries. They don't just sell. Just because I'm in the UK and I export to other countries, that does not make me a multinational corporation. So it's only if we operate, for example, having part of our production or customer service done overseas. So how does having more of these global companies increase globalization? Well, your MNCs are typically the ones responsible for increased levels of FDI, because they're going to potentially be investing in these different countries, setting up their production. Of course, it expands their global sales because they'll be selling to multiple different markets. And they've got a lot more pressure to do this because their shareholders are expecting larger returns. So they need to look at these expansions into different countries. And of course, as well, if the MNC is looking at FDI, then it will typically create employment opportunities within that economy, overall contributing to economic growth. Another important factor is also the increased level of foreign direct investment, which we have gone over quite a bit now, but just to add to your guys' notes if you are taking them, foreign direct investment, we know is going to boost global business activity and trade. It will hopefully start creating more international job opportunities and transfer knowledge across borders. So for example, if I am a UK company looking to set up some facilities in a developing country, then of course I want to make sure that my operations still maintain those quality standards. So we have what we call a transfer of knowledge across borders. And FDI, as we said, can support emerging economies because we're creating jobs for them. Because if people are earning more money, they start to spend more money. And that then produces more tax revenues for the government. And overall, they can start investing back into the country. And that's what stimulates economic growth. Another factor that increases our globalization will be migration. And all this is the movement of people, even within borders, so internally, or across borders, internationally. And migration typically happens for work purposes, education, so you want to go get a degree in a different country, or of course better living conditions. How does migration contribute to globalization? Well, first of all, it expands the global workforce. It increases the level of supply for workers for these companies. So what you'll typically find is that if the level of supply of workers is increasing, typically businesses can get away with offering them lower wages, so their labour costs begin to reduce. It also promotes more cultural exchanges, so if someone moves from one country to another, they would potentially be bringing their culture with them. So it may start to increase the demand for their type of goods and services that they're used to back in their home country, for example, food and drink. And overall, that would increase the level of demand for those cultural goods. And another major factor as well is the growth of the global labour force. Now, more people working across the world has increased global spending. Because of course, if people are earning more money, they get to then spend that money. So what you might find is that they're importing goods from across seas. And not only that, as we mentioned earlier, the higher the supply there is of workers, typically provides more cheaper labour for businesses. So that's why we see increased levels of globalisation, because people who might be migrating to new countries may offer opportunities for businesses to offer them lower wages. And the very final factor that has contributed to growth of globalisation will be any structural changes. Now, structural changes, think of the market changes. We've seen recently the growth of the tertiary sector, also known as the service sector, because there's been an increased level of demand for international services, but it's also extremely easy to sell these overseas. So the growth of these online services has enabled more digital trade across the world. And because of how easy it is to expand, what you'll find is that these service businesses are expanding across borders. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video, which is an important one, will be about protectionism. Now, what is protectionism all about? Essentially, protectionism is when governments impose specific trade barriers to try and reduce the amount that the country is importing. Because as we saw earlier, when we are importing goods, the money is flowing out of the country. And if we have an imbalance between exports and imports, i.e. we're importing more than we're exporting, this negatively impacts our GDP. And of course, the reason why a country also wants to do this is that they want to protect their domestic industries from these large foreign competitors. Because if we had a small company in the UK, but they were growing quite well, they would find it very challenging still to try and compete against these large foreign firms. Because if these foreign firms outcompete the UK domestic business, that UK domestic business who is employing UK individuals, they may go under. And of course, all those people would lose jobs, increasing unemployment rate, which once again negatively impacts our GDP. Now, the problem with protectionism is that let's say we start putting it against other countries. Well, what's going to happen is that they're going to start to put those protectionist policies against us. So our UK exporters would then begin to suffer from this. Now, we've got different ways of protectionism. We've got tariffs and quotas. Those are the direct ones, but we've also got indirect ones as well with subsidies and also government legislation. Let's break each of these down, starting off with tariffs. Now, tariffs, think the first two letters, TA. Tariffs are basically when we impose taxes on imported goods. Now, the reason why the governments want to do this is because, first of all, it would increase the selling price of those imported goods, and it would also produce some tax revenue for the government, so we can then invest that back into the UK. So how this would potentially look. So let's say I'm a UK customer and I'm about to import a £100 watch. But because there is a 100% tariff, that is now going to cost me £200. So as a UK customer, I may now be put off from spending £200 and go to a UK business instead. But what about a UK business? Maybe we could look at importing raw materials. So let's say we're importing £10 million of raw materials. That 100% tariff now increases the cost to £20 million. So rather than using these foreign businesses for my raw materials, I may look at more domestic businesses. So if the price of imported goods rises, consumers are now more likely to switch to domestic businesses because we are simply looking at the law of demand. As the level of price increases, typically demand for those goods will decrease. So we may look for more cheaper alternatives. Now, this is really your A and A star territory because I want to bring in a concept that we learned earlier on in theme 1. How does the effectiveness of tariffs depend on the price elasticity of demand? I know a lot of you hate it, so if you haven't already, make sure you go watch my revision videos on there. And the way it would impact it is that if our product is price elastic, meaning that the change in price will cause a greater proportional change in demand because your customers are sensitive to price changes. And remember that relationship, prices go up, level of demands goes down. So if they are sensitive to those changes in price, an increase in price will cause a greater decrease in demand. So that would actually be really effective at reducing the number of imports. But if it is inelastic, this is when the change in price causes a smaller proportional change in demand. Your customers are now less sensitive to those changes in price. So now even if we increase the price, demand would still fall, but not by that much. So the tariff becomes less effective. The next form of protectionism that we now have is what we would call a quota. And these are government imposed limits on the quantity or the value. So either a limit on how many we're importing or the actual sales value of specific goods that can be imported during a period of time. So as an example, let's say each year the UK is importing 1 billion watches from China. Well, what the quota may say is we're going to restrict that amount only now down to 100 million units. Now, what this would do is, well, as a customer, I can't import these goods now from the overseas market or as a UK business. So I'm going to have to look elsewhere. I may have to start looking to more domestic businesses instead. Now, what that would do is that would increase the level of sales for those UK businesses. And what else might happen is because that foreign company knows that they can't sell as many units, they may once again decide to increase their prices because they still want to make a substantial amount of revenue on that deal. So once again, the increase in price, law of demand would stay, demand would typically reduce. So that could make our domestic businesses more competitive with their pricing. Now, we also have an extreme form of a quota because a quota is just a specific limit. An extreme form of this is what we would call an embargo. And this is a government imposed ban, i.e. we do not trade at all with that specific country. And the next form of protectionism, which is typically more indirect, is government legislation. Now, we've learned about legislations earlier on in theme 2. These are the laws and regulations that set strict standards for imported goods. Now, you might be asking, well, how does this restrict it? Well, I've got a few examples for you. First of all, we've got environmental standards. So the EU prohibits the import of goods made with certain chemicals, such as specific peptides or plastics that don't meet its environmental regulations. So if you are a business or a customer within the EU, you can't import certain goods. And we can also look at specific health concerns. Now, in 2011, many countries actually had a legislation that banned food imports from Japan due to the fear of radioactive contaminants following a nuclear disaster. And we've also got cultural standards. So for example, some Middle Eastern countries, they restrict the import of products that conflict with their cultural or religious values, like alcohol or certain types of media. And the final form of protectionism that we have is our domestic subsidies. Now, a subsidy is financial support provided by the government to domestic industries to reduce their costs and make them more competitive within that market. So with subsidies, we're not restricting the amount of goods that can be imported into the country, but what we're doing instead is that we're making our domestic businesses more competitive in the international landscape. So what this could look like then is subsidies could include grants, tax relief, and low or zero interest rate loans to support those domestic businesses. So what we are doing is we're supporting our UK companies by lowering their costs, making them more competitive. They would typically spend this subsidy on factors such as reducing their production cost, so making it cheaper to produce products. They also could look at research and development, so look at new technologies, new innovative products that are differentiated and gives them that competitive advantage. It also could support with employee wages and training programs, and as well helping the UK businesses potentially start to enter those international markets. And the very last thing that we need to do in this revision video is take a look at our trading blocks. Now, what on earth is a trading bloc? Essentially, this links quite closely with our trade liberalisation and the removal of trade barriers. Essentially, a trading bloc is a group of countries that agree to reduce or eliminate trade barriers between them to encourage more trade. Now, with the trading bloc, you'll find that the countries within there are located quite closely to each other. And if you are a country outside of that trading bloc, you would typically find that there are protectionist policies against you. Now, we've got 3 on the screen, as you can see: EU, ASEAN, and NAFTA. Now, you don't need to know individual statistics about each of them, but you do need to know about them and what it could mean to be within there. Starting off with the EU. Now, the EU is a political economic union of 27 European countries that promote free trade, economic cooperation, and political stability. It also allows free movement of goods, services, capital, and people between the different countries within the EU. They will also set common regulations, policies, and also strategies to try and strengthen their economic growth as a whole. And some of the members within the EU actually share the common currency of the euro. Now, not every country in Europe is part of the EU, and obviously we famously left it in 2020. And the next trading bloc that we have is ASEAN. So with ASEAN, this is known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And it's made up of around 10 countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on at the time of this recording. Now, it tries to promote economic, political, and security when cooperating with each other, and tries to promote free trade. And the next trading bloc that we have, it used to be called NAFTA, but now it's called the USMCA. So NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and this was between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, designed to eliminate most tariffs and trade barriers to encourage a bit more economic activity between them. But in 2020, NAFTA, the name, was replaced by the United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement, which is now why it's known as the USMCA, which updated trade rules in areas such as digital trade, labour markets, and environmental protection. And as I said, it eliminates most trades. Now, of course, with the new presidential election in America, those trade barriers are seeming to come out again. And the last thing that we need to do in this topic and in this revision video is take a look at the impacts of businesses from being within a trading bloc. Well, first of all, it's good because hopefully that trading bloc has removed those protectionist policies, have removed those trade barriers. So it's promoting more free and open trade. So what that means is that it's easier for me to export to different countries within that trading bloc. So those customers who are buying my goods aren't paying tariffs, so my prices are more competitive. There's also no limits on how much I can sell to them. And as well, if it's easier for you to sell to these different customers in the trading bloc, it provides you with a larger market. And of course, the larger market could help increase your levels of output, which gives you access to economies of scale by reducing the unit cost because your fixed costs are spread over more units. And we also find that more labour movement happens. So as a business, I now have access to a larger talent pool. However, it can be quite problematic because yes, it provides me with more opportunities, but it also provides more opportunities for every business within that trading block. So now the levels of competition actually begins to increase. Remember, the whole point of protectionism is to reduce the threat of those foreign competitors. If you've got no protectionism, if trade barriers don't really exist, there's more competition now. And as well, as a country, you may have really good relations with other countries outside of that trading bloc. But that trading bloc may permit you to have those free trade policies. And as well, if you are within that trading bloc, there are certain regulations that you may have to abide by. So for that company, we know that these new legislations typically increase our business's costs, and you don't want to become too reliant on the trading bloc itself. If you found this revision video useful and want to continue revising Theme 4 topics, then I highly recommend you check out our video here on Theme 4.2, Global Markets and Business Expansion, as we're going to be looking at some key concepts such as assessing a country as a production location and a market. We'll also look at different reasons for global mergers and joint ventures. We'll then look at global competitiveness and so much more. Thank you so much for watching these revision videos. I really do hope it's been helpful for revising for your exams. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.